you've decided to join us. Excellent. Before we delve into the deep, churning waters of history, a quick thought. If you find yourself utterly captivated by the shadows we explore here, a simple click of that subscribe button would be a welcome beacon in the dark. It's a small act, but it helps us navigate these chilling narratives to you. Now, whether you're listening late at night in America, the last whispers of the day fading around you, or perhaps it's the early hours in Russia, the first light of dawn barely piercing the gloom, remember this: you are safe. You are in your home, surrounded by the familiar. But they weren't. They were trapped, adrift not in the sea itself, but in a prison of stone and fear, with the ocean's relentless roar as their only constant companion, and a terror that seeped not from external threats, but from within the very confines of their existence. What would you do, I wonder, if you were sealed in with death itself, the only witness to a horror that no living soul could possibly comprehend until it became their own suffocating reality? What would you become when the line between sanity and madness blurred, not in a sudden snap, but a slow, agonizing erosion, chipped away by the relentless waves and the ghastly company you were forced to keep? The Smalls Lighthouse. The name itself seems innocuous, almost quaint, doesn't it? A small sentinel bravely facing the vast, indifferent might of the Atlantic. But there was nothing small about the terror it once held, nothing quaint about the psychological crucible it became for two men, forgotten by the world, remembered only by the whispers of history and the relentless, unforgiving tide. To truly understand the horror, we must first understand its setting, its genesis. The Smalls Lighthouse stands to this day a testament to human resilience and folly, an isolated pillar in the Treach waters off the coast of Pembrokeshire, Wales, a remote windswept rock, barely breaking the surface of the Celtic Sea. It was a place where the land ended and the true wilderness began, a perilous stretch of ocean that had, for centuries, claimed countless ships and lives, their timbers splintered, their crews swallowed by the insatiable deep. Before the lighthouse, it was a maritime graveyard, marked by the silent ghosts of those who had misjudged the currents, underestimated the fury of the storms, or simply been unlucky enough to stray too close to the unforgiving fangs of the rock. The first attempt to conquer this watery menace, to place a beacon of hope amidst the despair, came in 1776. This was not a grand, imposing structure of stone and mortar, but a somewhat precarious wooden edifice, a collection of 9 stout oak pillars, each a foot thick, driven into the very rock of the Smalls. Imagine the audaciousness, the sheer human will, to erect such a fragile-looking contraption in such a merciless environment. It was designed by a man named Henry Whiteside, a resourceful engineer who understood the brutal power of the sea. These pillars, splayed outwards like the legs of some enormous prehistoric insect, supported a modest dwelling, a lantern room perched atop, high above the reach of most waves, or so they hoped. It was a marvel of its time, an improbable achievement against overwhelming odds. But it was also a promise of isolation, a guarantee of separation from everything that made life bearable, from the comforting presence of other human beings, from the simple, grounding touch of solid land. The construction itself was a saga of hardship. Workers battled not only the relentless elements, the churning sea, the whipping winds, the blinding spray, but also the sheer logistics of transporting materials to this desolate outpost. Every plank, every nail, It was a constant reminder of their fragility, their utter insignificance in the face of nature's wrath. And it was in this crucible of isolation and terror that our tragic tale truly begins to unfold, drawing us deeper into the chilling depths of human endurance. Into this desolate realm, in the year 1801, stepped two men whose names would forever be etched into the dark annals of maritime legend, Thomas Howell and Thomas Griffith. Two men, sharing a common first name, yet possessing distinct personalities, thrown together in the most isolating of circumstances, destined to become unwilling players in a real-life horror story. Thomas Howell, the elder of the two, was a man of stern countenance and considerable experience. He was the principal keeper, responsible for the light, for the maintenance, for the very survival of the station. He was, by all accounts, a meticulous, disciplined individual, perhaps a little rigid in his ways, a man who believed in order and routine, precisely the qualities one might expect, indeed require, of someone tasked with such a critical and dangerous duty. He had, no doubt, seen his share of gales, weathered countless storms, and faced the gnawing loneliness of the Smalls many times over. His life was the lighthouse, a demanding mistress that consumed his days and nights, leaving little room for sentiment or frivolousness. Then there was Thomas Griffith, the assistant keeper. Griffith was, reportedly, a different sort of man altogether. Younger, perhaps, and by some accounts, of a more volatile temperament. There are whispers, faint echoes from the past, that Griffith was a man prone to argument, perhaps a bit impetuous, certainly less inclined to meekly follow Howell's lead. Imagine the dynamic. Two strong-willed individuals, confined within the minuscule living space of that wooden structure, miles from anywhere, with no escape from each other's presence. No distractions, no other voices, no chance to walk away and cool down. Every petty annoyance, every minor disagreement, every unspoken resentment would fester and grow in that enclosed space, amplified by the constant roar of the sea and the crushing weight of their solitude. The very air they breathed would be thick with unspoken tension, a psychological pressure cooker where trivialities could escalate into monumental grievances. Their days were a monotonous cycle of duties, tending the lamp, cleaning the lenses, checking the structure for damage, making minor repairs, logging the weather, all under the watchful, unblinking eye of the sea. Their nights were a vigil, ensuring the light burned bright, a tiny, defiant star against the vast, encompassing darkness. Food, brought by supply ship, would be rationed carefully. Water, collected from rain, was a precious commodity. Their world shrunk to the dimensions of their small living quarters, their universe defined by the four walls of their stone prison, the endless gray of the sky, and the ceaseless hypnotizing rhythm of the waves. There was no privacy, no personal space, nothing but the constant, inescapable presence of the other man. Imagine waking each morning to the same face, day after day, seeing the same expressions, hearing the same sounds, with no respite, no variation, nothing new to stimulate the mind. The human spirit, accustomed to variety, to interaction, to freedom, is not built for such an ordeal. It begins to fray at the edges, to unravel slowly, silently, in the depths of such profound isolation. Pane of glass had to be ferried across miles of unpredictable ocean, a perilous journey in itself. They faced mountainous waves that threatened to sweep them from their precarious perches, gale-force winds that screamed like tormented spirits, and the constant, chilling spray that coated everything in a salty, corrosive film. Yet, against all these odds, the lighthouse slowly, painstakingly, rose from the waves. It was not a monument to beauty, but to necessity. A stark, utilitarian structure designed to withstand the unceasing assault of nature. The living quarters were cramped, the windows thick with salt, the air constantly damp and cold, permeated by the smell of brine and lamp oil. It was a place designed for function, not comfort, a place where men were sent to endure, to survive, to keep the light burning, no matter the cost. And the cost, as we shall see, could be immeasurable. The wooden structure, for all its ingenuity, was inherently vulnerable. It swayed and groaned in the storms, the timbers creaking like the bones of a dying giant. The sea, with its boundless patience, constantly tested its limits, battering the pillars, eroding the rock beneath, seeking out every weakness. It was a battle fought day in and day out, a silent war between human endeavor and nature's raw power. The keepers who manned this isolated outpost were not just light tenders, they were guardians of a fragile flame, their lives a constant vigil against the encroaching darkness and the relentless, hungry sea. They were brave men, Certainly, but bravery alone could not shield them from the profound psychological toll of such an existence. And if you are still with us, wrapped in the chilling embrace of this narrative, remember to consider subscribing. It helps us illuminate more of these forgotten corners of history. The very remoteness of the Smalls Lighthouse was its defining characteristic, its most terrifying feature. It was approximately 20 miles off the coast, a distance that, in the days before reliable motor vessels, was an eternity. 20 miles of open, often tempestuous sea. 20 miles of separation from aid, from communication, from any semblance of normal human interaction. For weeks, sometimes months, the keepers would be utterly cut off, their only connection to the outside world. The occasional supply ship, a fleeting glimpse of another human face before the waves swallowed it again. The silence, broken only by the shriek of gulls and the eternal roar of the ocean, could be deafening, a relentless pressure on the mind. The horizon, an unbroken circle of gray sky meeting gray sea, offered no comfort, only an endless vista of isolation. There was no escape, nowhere to go, nothing to see but the same vast expanse, day after day, night after night. And then there were the storms. Oh, the storms. Not merely bad weather, but cataclysms, titanic struggles between wind and water that would make the stoutest heart tremble. The wooden lighthouse, for all its strength, would shudder and vibrate, the entire structure groaning under the onslaught. Waves, not just breaking over the rock, but sometimes reaching the living quarters themselves, crashing against the windows, sending spray high above the lantern room. The very air would be thick with the roar and thunder, the world outside a maelstrom of white foam and black water. Inside, the men would huddle, their faces lit by the flickering lamp, listening to the cacophony, wondering if this storm, this particular fury, would be the one that finally tore their sanctuary apart, sending them plummeting into the icy depths. The psychological impact of such events, endured repeatedly, month after month, year after year, cannot be overstated. Howell, the senior man, likely tried to maintain a semblance of order, a strict adherence to the rules, believing it was the only way to preserve sanity in such an environment. Griffith, perhaps resentful of Howell's authority, or simply chafing under the relentless monotony and the older man's stringent ways, would have pushed back, subtly at first, then perhaps more overtly. Arguments would erupt over trivial matters, the cleanliness of a pot, the timing of a task, a word misinterpreted, a glance misconstrued. Each man, convinced of his own rectitude, would find the other's presence increasingly grating, increasingly unbearable. The lighthouse, meant to be a sanctuary for those at sea, became a psychological battlefield for those within its walls. The isolation, which initially might have seemed merely a challenge, slowly transformed into a suffocating burden, a weight that pressed down on their very souls, distorting perceptions, amplifying anxieties, nurturing a quiet, insidious paranoia. The relentless wind, the ceaseless crashing of waves, the sheer overwhelming emptiness of the horizon, all these external forces conspired to erode their inner peace. Sleep would be fitful, haunted by the sounds of the storm, by the creaking timbers, by the imagined whispers of the sea. Their conversations, if they had any beyond the necessary exchange of duties, would become strained, clipped, punctuated by long, uncomfortable silences. They were two men marooned together, not on a desert island, but on a sliver of rock, surrounded by the vastness of the ocean, and trapped within the confines of their own escalating animosity. This was their existence, their daily reality, a slow-burn psychological torment that predated the true horror to come, preparing the ground for the unimaginable events that would soon unfold. And as we plunge deeper into this chilling account, don't forget that a subscription helps us bring these forgotten terrors to light. Their fears, too, would be unique to their predicament. Fear of the sea, of course. A primal, ever-present dread. Fear of mechanical failure, of the lamp going out, plunging ships into peril and bringing down the wrath of their superiors. But perhaps the most insidious fear was of each other, or rather, of what the other might become under the relentless pressure. The human mind, when deprived of external stimuli and natural social interaction, can begin to turn inward, to conjure its own demons. Suspicion, distrust, and resentment, once minor irritations, could blossom into full-blown paranoia. Each man would begin to scrutinize the other, searching for flaws, for signs of weakness, for hints of malefic intent. The boundaries of their shared reality would begin to blur, stretched thin by the unending isolation and the ceaseless hypnotic rhythm of the waves. They were locked in a silent internal struggle, each battling his own demons, while simultaneously being forced to coexist with the perceived demons of the other. The stage was set, the players in place, and the curtain was about to rise on a tragedy that would forever change the way lighthouses were manned. A chilling testament to the devastating power of isolation and fear. The fragile peace, or perhaps more accurately, the strained truce that existed between Thomas Howell and Thomas Griffith, was shattered not by an external force, but by the insidious creep of disease. It began subtly, as these things often do. A cough, a fever, a general malaise that Griffith, the younger man, might initially have dismissed as a common cold. A transient discomfort easily remedied. But in the extreme isolation of the Smalls Lighthouse, a simple ailment could quickly become a death sentence, a horrifying descent into illness with no medical aid, no comforting presence, no escape. There, 20 miles from shore, with only Howell as his unwilling nurse, Griffith's condition rapidly deteriorated. The details of his illness are scarce, lost to the mists of time and the limited records of the era. Some accounts suggest a fever, others a more sudden affliction. What is certain is that Thomas Griffith became gravely ill, and his decline was swift and agonizing. Imagine the scene. The cramped living quarters, already permeated by the smell of salt and lamp oil, now filled with the sickly odor of illness. The rhythmic creaking of the wooden structure, usually a constant background hum, would become a maddening drone, each groan of the timbers echoing Griffith's own suffering. Howell, the stoic principal keeper, would have found himself in an impossible position. He was not a doctor, had no medicine, and the ferocity of the winter gales that often beset the Smalls meant that a rescue boat was out of the question, perhaps for weeks. As Griffith's condition worsened, the atmosphere in the lighthouse would have shifted from strained coexistence to a profound, suffocating dread. Howell would have watched, helpless, as his fellow keeper wasted away, each labored breath, each pained moan, a stark reminder of his own vulnerability. The constant roar of the sea, once meteors, eerily a backdrop, would now seem to mock them, its indifferent power a stark contrast to the human frailty unfolding within the lighthouse walls. Days bled into nights, marked only by the dwindling light in Griffith's eyes, the increasing difficulty of his breathing. The silence, when Griffith finally drifted into unconsciousness, would have been almost as terrifying as his suffering. And then, it happened. The moment that would forever seal Howell's fate, that would plunge him into a nightmare from which he might never truly recover. Thomas Griffith died. A simple, undeniable fact, yet one that held within it the seeds of unimaginable horror. The precise date is unknown, swallowed by the waves and the passage of time, but it occurred sometime in January 1801, during a particularly ferocious period of winter storms. One moment, Howell had a living, breathing, albeit dying, human being for company. The next, he was alone, utterly and completely alone, with a corpse. The immediate aftermath would have been a maelstrom of shock, grief, and an overwhelming primal fear. Howell, a man of routine and order, was suddenly confronted with the ultimate disorder: death. But it wasn't just the death that plunged him into despair. It was the horrifying implications of it. In an age when suspicion ran rampant, when communication was slow and unreliable, Howell immediately grasped the terrifying predicament he was in. Here he was, miles from shore, with the body of his assistant keeper. Who would believe that Griffith had simply died of natural causes? Would they suspect foul play? Would he be accused of murder, locked away in this isolated stone prison, with only the dead for company, until a rescue ship, if it ever came, could deliver him to a far grimmer fate? The fear of accusation, of being condemned without a witness to defend him, would have been a palpable, suffocating sense, more terrifying perhaps than even the corpse itself. His mind, already frayed by weeks of isolation and the escalating tension with Griffith, would have reeled. What could he do? He couldn't simply leave the body inside. The small living space, already cramped, would become a tomb. The smell of decay overwhelming. The constant presence of the dead man an unbearable torment. He was trapped by the weather, trapped by the vastness of the sea, and now, trapped by the grim reality of a corpse that threatened to condemn him. It was a dilemma born of the most extreme isolation, a choice no man should ever have to make. And so, Howell made a decision, born of desperation and a burgeoning terror. A decision that would solidify his descent into madness and become the most haunting detail of the Smalls Lighthouse tragedy. He couldn't keep the body inside. He couldn't bury it. The hard, unyielding rock of the Smalls offered no gravesite. But he also couldn't simply cast it into the sea. That would be an even greater act of suspicion, a clear sign of an attempt to dispose of evidence. So, he devised a grotesque compromise, a horrifying solution to an impossible problem. He would secure Griffith's body outside the lighthouse. Imagine the scene, the chilling, morbid details. Howell, alone in the howling gale, the waves crashing around the base of the lighthouse, the wind tearing at his clothes. He would have had to drag Griffith's lifeless form through the narrow confines of the living quarters, out onto the precarious wooden platform that encircled the lantern room. The sheer physical effort, combined with the psychological horror of moving a dead man, would have been immense. He would have found ropes, crude and chafing against his hands, and with painstaking, desperate effort, he tied Griffith's body to the railing of the lighthouse. He secured it there, high above the waves, ostensibly in the hope that if a ship passed, they would see two keepers, not just one, thus allaying suspicion, preventing the unthinkable accusation from being leveled against him. But perhaps it was also an act of self-preservation, a desperate attempt to remove the decaying presence from his confined living space, to give himself some semblance of sanity, even as his actions plunged him deeper into the abyss. The body, stiff and cold, would have been a grotesque sentinel, swaying with the force of the wind, silhouetted against the stormy sky, a constant, horrifying reminder of his predicament. It was a desperate act, born of fear and isolation, and it would prove to be the beginning of Howell's true ordeal, a descent into a living nightmare that would forever haunt the lonely Smalls Lighthouse. And as this chilling narrative unfolds, I encourage you, if you haven't already, to subscribe. We have many more such tales waiting to be unearthed from the shadows of history. The death of Thomas Griffith, and the subsequent macabre act of securing his body outside the lighthouse, was merely the prelude to the true horror, the opening act of Thomas Howell's descent into madness. For the very elements that had trapped him with a dying man now conspired to amplify his torment 1,000-fold. Almost immediately after Griffith's body was lashed to the railing, a storm of unprecedented ferocity descended upon the Smalls. Not just a gale, but a relentless, weeks-long tempest that transformed the ocean into a churning, frothing maelstrom, and the lighthouse into a besieged fortress. The waves, already formidable, grew into monstrous green giants, rearing up from the depths to crash against the wooden pillars with bone-jarring force. The entire structure of the lighthouse groaned and shuddered, a living entity racked with pain. The sound was deafening, A continuous, roaring thunder that vibrated through Howell's very bones, stripping away any semblance of peace or quiet. The wind, a screaming banshee, tore at the timbers, rattled the windows, and howled through every crack and crevice. A constant, tormenting presence. Visibility would have been almost non-existent. The world outside a blurry, terrifying canvas of white spray and gray gloom. Inside, Howell was utterly alone. Alone, that is, except for the unyielding, inescapable presence of the storm and the horrifying knowledge of what lay just beyond the glass of his lantern room, just outside his flimsy door. Griffith's corpse. The body, tied to the railing, became a macabre weather vane, swaying, turning, its spectral form a constant, horrifying fixture in his peripheral vision whenever he ventured to the lantern room. The wind and the waves, those tireless sculptors, began their work on the deceased. The constant spray would have plastered his clothes to his stiffening form, freezing and thawing with the fluctuating temperatures. The wind would have tugged at his limbs, his hair, his tattered garments, creating a grotesque dance of the dead, a silent, mocking jig against the backdrop of the furious ocean. Imagine Howell, huddled inside, the lamp casting flickering shadows across his increasingly gaunt face. Every creak of the wood, every shriek of the wind, every crash of a wave would have been amplified 100-fold by his heightened state of terror and isolation. He would stare out, through the salt-encrusted panes, at the grotesque tableau. The body, his former companion, would appear to be moving, swaying in the wind, a chillingly lifelike puppet animated by the elements. His mind, deprived of sleep and normal human interaction, would begin to play tricks on him. Was that a twitch? A shift in position? Was Griffith in some spectral form, trying to break free? Was he reaching out? The boundaries of reality and delusion would blur, indistinguishable in the relentless, terrifying isolation. The smell, too, would have been a torment. Even though the body was outside, the constant damp, the raw power of the wind, might have carried faint, decaying whispers of it into the lighthouse. Or perhaps, and more likely, it was his own mind, conjuring the phantom scent, adding another layer to his sensory deprivation and psychological torment. He was trapped in a coffin of his own making, with a dead man as his cellmate, and the entire ocean as his jailer. The fear of being accused, which had driven him to this extreme act, now mingled with the far more primal, suffocating terror. The terror of being alone with the dead. The terror of his own unraveling mind. Days bled into weeks. The storm showed no signs of abating. Howell would tend the lamp, mechanically performing his duties, his body running on adrenaline and the desperate need for survival, while his mind slowly, meticulously, was picked apart by the relentless psychological assault. He would pace the cramped living quarters, his own footsteps echoing in the cavernous roar of the storm, a sound almost as loud as the frantic pounding of his own heart. He would stare at the walls, at the few meager possessions, anything to distract himself from the horrifying presence outside. But it was always there, an unblinking, unmoving presence, watching him, judging him, becoming the focal point of his unraveling sanity. Paranoia began to set in, a creeping, insidious poison. He would imagine Griffith's eyes, even though they were closed, staring at him. He would hear whispers on the wind, convinced they were the dead man's voice, accusing him, condemning him. Every shadow would seem to shift. Every creak of the lighthouse would sound like footsteps. Every drop of water dripping inside would be a ghostly tear. The line between what was real and what was conjured by his tormented mind dissolved entirely. He was not just alone. He was alone with a ghost, a specter of his own making, a horrifying manifestation of his guilt and his fear. He would talk to himself, argue with himself, perhaps even with the image of Griffith outside, desperate for any form of human interaction, even if it was with his own fractured psyche. Sleep, when it came, would be a fragile, fleeting reprieve, haunted by nightmares, by the image of Griffith's swaying form, by the knowledge that outside, just beyond the glass, his macabre vigil continued. He was losing his grip slowly, painfully, his mind succumbing to the overwhelming pressure of isolation, fear, and the relentless, maddening presence of the Diu, Iad. The Smalls Lighthouse, once a beacon of hope, had become a tomb, a madman's prison, and the stage for a psychological horror unlike anything seen before or since. And as you listen, enveloped by this chilling tale, remember the importance of supporting independent storytelling. A subscription helps ensure these dark histories continue to be told. The constant, unceasing roar of the sea, once a familiar companion, now became an instrument of torture, a relentless, deafening cacophony that drowned out coherent thought. He couldn't escape it. There was no silence, no peace, only the endless, thundering symphony of the storm. It was a sensory overload that, combined with the lack of human contact and the horrifying spectacle outside, drove him deeper into the labyrinth of his own mind. He would peer out, not just to check the lamp, but compelled by a morbid fascination, a terror that he could not resist. And each time, the sight was the same. Griffith's body, a grim scarecrow against the tempest, a silent judge in the relentless, unforgiving court of the sea. The image would burn itself into his retinas, searing into his memory, becoming the singular focus of his existence. He was trapped, not just physically, but mentally, in a horrifying loop of fear, paranoia, and guilt. With no clear path to escape, only the slow, agonizing descent into the abyss of his own shattered mind. The lighthouse, this isolated monument to human ingenuity, had become a crucible, forging a horror so profound that its echoes would ripple through history for centuries to come. The storm, like all storms, eventually began to abate, its furious energy slowly draining away, leaving behind a bruised and battered sea. For weeks, the Smalls Lighthouse had been invisible, shrouded by the tempest, a lost sentinel in the chaos. But as the skies cleared and the waves began to recede, a glimmer of hope, albeit a terrifying one, appeared on the horizon. A supply ship, long overdue, finally managed to approach the rock. The sight of the vessel, a smudge on the distant horizon, would have been an overwhelming torrent of emotions for Thomas Howell. Relief, certainly, a desperate, gut-wrenching relief that his ordeal might finally be over. But mingled with that relief would have been a resurgence of his initial terror, the fear of accusation, the chilling understanding that the moment of reckoning was finally at hand. He would have watched, his heart pounding in his chest, as the ship drew closer, each wave bringing it inevitably towards the grim truth he had so desperately tried to manage. As the boat neared the lighthouse, the crew on board would have scanned the structure, expecting the usual sight of two keepers. And there, against the weathered wood, they saw a figure. But something was immediately, terrifyingly wrong. The figure was clearly human, but it was stiff, unnaturally still, lashed to the railing, swaying with an eerie, unnatural rhythm in the lingering wind. It was a sight that would have frozen the blood in their veins, a grotesque tableau that spoke of unimaginable horrors. The very air around the lighthouse seemed to hum with an unspoken dread. When they finally managed to make a landing, a perilous feat even in calmer waters, the scene that greeted them was one of profound shock and revulsion. They found Thomas Howell, not greeting them with the usual robust welcome, but a spectral figure, gaunt, hollow-eyed, his face etched with weeks of terror and sleepless nights. His clothes were tattered, his hair wild, his eyes wide and vacant, staring out at something far beyond the physical world. He was a man utterly broken, a survivor not of the sea, but of his own shattered mind. And then, there was Griffith's body, still lashed to the railing, a horrifying frozen testament to Howell's desperate act. The elements had taken their toll. The body was exposed, discolored, A ghastly sight that confirmed the silent, terrible tale of isolation and despair. The crew, hardened men of the sea, would have been stunned into silence, their faces reflecting a mixture of horror, pity, and a dawning comprehension of the unspeakable ordeal Howell had endured. No words were needed. The scene itself, the broken man and the macabre effigy outside, spoke volumes. Howell, when they tried to speak to him, would have been largely unresponsive, or perhaps his words were disjointed, rambling, infused with the paranoia that had consumed him. He might have tried to explain, to justify his actions, to plead his innocence, but his voice would have been weak, his arguments fragmented, overshadowed by the sheer, undeniable horror of what they were witnessing. His actions, though born of a desperate fear of accusation, had inadvertently created a visual testament to his agony, a chilling spectacle that would forever mark the Smalls Lighthouse in the public consciousness. The rescue party would have carefully, with heavy hearts, untied Griffith's body, respectfully bringing it inside. The air in the lighthouse, despite the open doors, would have been thick with the lingering scent of decay, the palpable residue of terror. Howell was removed from the lighthouse, carefully escorted onto the supply ship, a man utterly traumatized, a shadow of his former self. He had survived the physical ordeal, but the mental scars would be permanent, an indelible brand of the Smalls. He had walked through a valley of death, and he had returned, but not whole. He was a survivor, yes, but a profoundly broken one, forever haunted by the image of his dead companion swaying in the wind, and the terrifying whispers of his own unraveling mind. The journey back to shore would have been a somber one, the crew grappling with the grim reality of what they had witnessed. The story, once it raw, each the mainland, would have spread like wildfire, whispered in taverns, recounted in hushed tones in homes, debated in official circles. The sheer, unprecedented horror of a keeper tying his dead colleague to the outside of the lighthouse to avoid suspicion was a tale that gripped the public imagination, both repelling and fascinating them. It was a story that laid bare the brutal realities of isolation at sea, the profound psychological toll it could exact, and the desperate lengths to which a man might go when confronted with the unimaginable. The aftermath for Howell was, as expected, difficult. He was cleared of any wrongdoing, the circumstances of Griffith's death and his subsequent actions understood in the context of extreme isolation and psychological distress. But absolution from society could not absolve him from the torment within. He was irrevocably changed, a living testament to the dark side of solitude. His ordeal became a cautionary tale, a stark reminder of the delicate balance between sanity and madness when human connection is severed, when the self is left alone to battle its own demons in the relentless, indifferent embrace of the sea. And if this journey into the depths of human horror has held you captive, please consider subscribing. It allows us to continue bringing these unsettling narratives to your attention. The sea, that vast and indifferent entity, had claimed not just Griffith's life, but Howell's peace of mind, his very essence. It had used the isolation of the lighthouse as a surgical tool, carefully, methodically, dissecting his sanity, leaving him exposed and vulnerable. The rescue was not an ending to his suffering, but a transition, a shift from the physical prison of the Smalls to the internal prison of his own shattered memories. He would carry the images, the sounds, the smells of that terrible ordeal with him for the rest of his days, a silent internal echo of the screaming wind and the swaying corpse. The Smalls Lighthouse Tragedy, therefore, was not merely the story of a death, but the story of a life consumed by horror. A chilling testament to the profound and lasting scars that extreme isolation can inflict upon the human psyche. The horrific tale of Thomas Howell and Thomas Griffith at the Smalls Lighthouse did not fade into obscurity with the passing of the storm. Instead, it reverberated throughout Britain, carried on the winds of rumor and official reports, recounted in hushed tones from coastal villages to the bustling streets of London. It was a story that transcended mere maritime mishap. It was a profound, unsettling narrative about human vulnerability, the crushing weight of isolation, and the terrifying limits of sanity. The psychological horror of Howell's ordeal, the grotesque image of Griffith's corpse lashed to the lighthouse, burned itself into the public consciousness, sparking widespread discussion and a palpable sense of unease. The immediate and most significant legacy of the Smalls Lighthouse tragedy was a dramatic and permanent change in the rules governing lighthouse keeping. Before this incident, it was common practice for only 2 keepers to be stationed at remote lighthouses, a system that, in hindsight, proved to be dangerously flawed. The vulnerability of such a small crew to illness, accident, or even escalating personal animosity became glaringly obvious in the wake of Howell's ordeal. The possibility of one man dying and the survivor being left in such an impossible, horrifying predicament was now a stark, undeniable reality. The Trinity House, the official authority responsible for lighthouses in England and Wales, swiftly moved to implement a new policy. From that point forward, all remote offshore lighthouses would be manned by a minimum of 3 keepers. This seemingly simple change was revolutionary. It meant that if one keeper fell ill or died, there would still be 2 healthy individuals to manage the station, provide mutual support, and, crucially, to corroborate each other's accounts. It was a direct practical response to the psychological and logistical nightmare that Howell had endured. The Smalls Lighthouse tragedy thus became a grim but undeniable catalyst for improved safety and mental welfare provisions for those who served in such desolate outposts. The story also sparked broader reflections on human fragility and the immense power of the sea. Lighthouses, once seen purely as symbols of hope and guidance, now also carried an undertone of immense suffering and isolation. The public began to view the brave men who manned them with a new kind of respect, tinged with pity and a chilling understanding of the sacrifices they made. It was a stark reminder that even the most well-engineered structures could not shield the human spirit from the relentless, erosive power of extreme solitude. The sea, that beautiful, terrifying entity, was not just a force to be navigated, but a psychological crucible that could break even the strongest of wills. The Smalls Lighthouse itself became a landmark of grim renown, though the wooden structure that housed Howell and Griffith was eventually replaced by the magnificent granite tower that stands there today. The memory of the tragedy endured. The new stone lighthouse, a testament to greater engineering and safety, could not erase the whispers of the past. Sailors passing the Smalls, even decades later, would undoubtedly recall the chilling tale, perhaps casting a nervous glance at the distant, lonely beacon, imagining the unseen horrors it once contained. The name Smalls Lighthouse became synonymous not just with treacherous waters, but with a particular brand of psychological torment, a unique horror born of isolation and the unforgiving elements. This tragedy, while specific to a time and place, also serves as a timeless reflection on the human condition. It reminds us of our fundamental need for for interaction, for the grounding presence of other human beings. When those needs are denied, when we are stripped bare of social contact, the mind, left to its own devices, can become its own greatest tormentor. Howell's experience was an extreme example, but it underscores a universal truth about the delicate balance of our mental well-being. Isolation, while sometimes sought for solace or contemplation, can, in its extreme forms, lead to a profound and terrifying unraveling of the self. The story of the Smalls Lighthouse is not just a historical anecdote. It is a haunting warning. It speaks of the cruelty of the sea, yes, but more profoundly, of the cruelty that circumstances can inflict upon the human spirit. It is a testament to the fact that sometimes the greatest monsters are not external, but internal, born from fear, guilt, and the suffocating silence of absolute solitude. The Smalls Lighthouse, in its stark, remote beauty, continues to stand as a silent monument to this enduring truth, a beacon not just for ships, but for the darker corners of human experience, a place where the line between life and death, sanity and madness, became terrifyingly, tragically blurred. And as we navigate these final, haunting reflections, I once again invite you to join our growing community of listeners by subscribing. Your support ensures these important, often unsettling stories continue to be told. The echoes of this tragedy resonate even today, a stark reminder of the unseen battles fought by those in isolated professions. It reshaped the very fabric of lighthouse service, embedding within its regulations a profound understanding of the psychological vulnerabilities of its keepers. The Smalls Lighthouse, through its dark history, became more than just a navigational aid. It became a symbol of human endurance pushed to its breaking point, a chilling emblem of the profound sacrifices made by those who stood as guardians against the relentless, unforgiving might of the sea. Its legacy is etched not just in stone, but in the collective memory of maritime history. A haunting whisper of the dangers that lie not just in the waves, but within the deepest recesses of the human mind when left utterly, terrifyingly alone. And so, we return from the churning waters of 1801, back to the present, to the relative safety of your own space. But perhaps, as the last words of this tale settle around you, a chill lingers, doesn't it? A faint echo of the howling wind, a phantom flicker of the lamplight, a distant, unsettling image of a figure, swaying in the storm. The story of the Smalls Lighthouse Tragedy, with its grotesque details and its harrowing psychological descent, is more than just a historical account. It is a haunting reflection, a stark mirror held up to the darker facets of human experience. Consider this. In an increasingly connected world, where we are constantly surrounded by voices, by screens, by the incessant hum of communication, what would happen if it all suddenly ceased? If the lines went dead, the screens went dark, and you found yourself truly, utterly alone, with only your thoughts for company? The isolation experienced by Thomas Howell was extreme, brutal, a product of a time and technology far removed from our own. Yet, the core elements remain terrifyingly universal. The gnawing fear of being alone, the insidious creep of paranoia when left without external validation, the desperate need for human connection, and the fragile nature of our own sanity when pushed to its limits. The sea, in its vast, indifferent majesty, continues its work, slowly eroding coastlines, shaping landscapes, claiming what it will. And while we may no longer send men to endure such unimaginable psychological torment in remote lighthouses, the darkness that consumed Howell still exists. It lurks in the corners of our minds, a potential unleashed when the protective layers of society, of connection, of routine, are stripped away. What monsters might we conjure? What desperate acts might we commit when faced with an isolation so profound that it begins to distort the very fabric of our reality? The Smalls Lighthouse stands to this day, a solid, unyielding sentinel of granite, a testament to endurance. But if you were to stand upon its rock, to hear the ceaseless roar of the waves, to feel the spray upon your face, to gaze out at the endless horizon, could you not almost hear the faint whispers, the shriek of the wind carrying Griffith's spectral pleas, the silent screams of Howell's unraveling mind? The lighthouse, for all its strength, is a monument not just to navigation, but to the indelible scars left by a horror that transcended physical boundaries, a terror that burrowed deep into the human psyche. So, as you go about your day, as you rejoin the comforting hum of your own world, remember Thomas Howell and Thomas Griffith. Remember the Smalls Lighthouse. And perhaps, cast a thought to the thin, delicate veil that separates sanity from madness. A veil that, for two men marooned on a rock in the unforgiving sea, was torn asunder by the relentless waves and the ghastly company of death itself. You are safe now, but the echoes of their torment still resonate, a chilling reminder that some horrors, once unleashed, never truly fade. And if this journey into the depths has left you with a lingering sense of awe and dread, then perhaps you'll consider joining us by subscribing. Until next time, stay safe. And remember, the darkness is always closer than you think.